I've done a ton of side-by-side benchmarks here, but the main thing you're going to notice is that the 5080 can't really do anything from a raw power perspective to make your gaming meaningfully different when compared to the 4080 or 4080 Super, which have been available for a couple of years now. The 4080 Super is famously basically just a price cut on the 4080, which was overpriced at $1,200. The 4080 Super has about 3% better performance for a $200 price cut, and that launched a year ago. If you want evidence of that claim and why I'm not bothering to benchmark both the 4080 and the 4080 Super, I guess we could look at my 4080 versus 4080 Super versus 4090 video, where you freeze frame it at any given moment. The 4080 Super generally has a 2 to 3% performance uplift over the 4080. Again, it was really just a price cut. So essentially the question here is, do we get anything out of the 5080 that we couldn't have already got a year ago? Well, it's really not enough of a performance improvement to say that it's now good at 4K RT Overdrive full path tracing modes. Again, I'm going from 35 FPS on the 4080 Super to 39 FPS on the 5080. It's not making it suddenly very usable. I also tested out the older CNN model. That first comparison you just saw was the new Transformer model, and I'm not really seeing any meaningful differences by switching to the older model. Now, we could go to DLSS performance mode using the older model. That does get us 56 versus 63, so slightly under 60 FPS versus slightly over 60 FPS. I'm now seeing a 13% uplift for the 5080, but it's not like a dramatically different gaming experience. And trying out the new Transformer model brings frame rates down a little bit to 54 versus 60. 11% lead for the 5080. Again, not a mind-blowingly different experience on the two graphics cards. Here's the only place that there's an actual meaningful difference between the two. How much you value that depends, a bit on you. I'm messing up adjusting all my little camera windows here. This is frame generation. The 40 series supports ×2 frame generation, which is inserting one generated frame between every two rendered frames. And the 50 series can go up to ×4, which would be 3 generated frames in between every two rendered frames. And I mean, that is nice if you're on an extremely high refresh rate display and coming from a high base frame rate. So if you're on an extremely high refresh monitor, that can be nice. But again, we're not getting a much more powerful base frame rate, which is really the issue when using frame generation, is you want a high enough base frame rate for it to be a big, meaningful win. So I think it's a nice to have, but it's certainly not raw performance. If I go to 1440p RT Overdrive, for example, if we wanted to see if can we do native path tracing on the 5080 at 1440p, the answer is not really at the frame rates you'd like. I'm seeing 40 FPS versus 36, 11% advantage to the 5080, but neither one is really the frame rates you'd want to be playing at. So if you kick on DLSS quality with the older CNN model, the 5080 takes a 15% lead at 77 versus 67 on the 4080. It is a little bit better of an experience, but it's not a mind-blowingly different result, and honestly, you'd probably be using the new Transformer model. And when I switched over to that, I'm actually seeing a 9% lead, and the numbers are 73 and 67. So again, you're getting a similar experience on the two GPUs. I would say that they are arguably good for 1440p full path tracing modes if you're using DLSS quality, and the new Transformer model I think is the more exciting thing we're getting out of the 50 series launch, because it is definitely improving the image quality over the previous generation. Again, we could look at frame generation, where both can do the ×2 mode, getting you 117 versus 126 FPS from similar base frame rates. It's not a mind-blowing difference, 8% lead for the 5080. If you are on a very high refresh rate display, though, you could use the ×4 frame gen mode to get up to 227 FPS. So if you're on like a 240 hertz 1440p display, the 5080 will be able to take advantage of some additional motion fluidity with those higher frame gen levels, but remember, that's not making the game more responsive. If you look at the latency numbers I'm tracking up here, makes it slightly less responsive compared to the ×2 mode, but not in such a big deal that I think it's worth writing home about. So it's a nice to have, but I don't think it's a reason to buy a 5080 if you already had a 4080 or 4080 Super. If we look at Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, 4K Supreme settings. So this is a game that requires ray tracing, and these are the max settings other than the full RT mode. We're getting good experience at native 4K on both GPUs, 92 versus 83. But it's only 11% win on the 5080, not a mind-blowing generational upgrade or anything like that. If I try to kick on the full RT mode, even using DLSS performance upscaling, neither GPU has enough VRAM. We're going over 16 gigabytes of VRAM usage here. Both GPUs are hitting 3 FPS, so they're tied here, but it's not settings you would use anyway. Now, don't panic about the 16 gigabytes of VRAM. It would be nice to have more, but if you slot the texture cache size to very ultra instead of supreme, which just means it's a slightly different texture cache, you'll still see just as high res of textures. It's just technically they could load in more of them and further from the screen and things like that using the higher texture cache. Now we're getting 55 versus 49 FPS, 12% lead for the 5080. If we drop down to 1440p Supreme and full RT, we're getting 42 versus 38. So again, not really strong enough for a native path tracing implementation even at 1440p, but if we jump up to DLSS quality, we are now around 60 FPS. The 5080 is slightly above, the 4080 Super is slightly below, 57 versus 63. It's an 11% lead for the 5080. At 1440p Supreme settings, so if we don't use the full RT mode but are using the game's normal ray tracing, it's an 8% lead for the 5080 at 138 versus 128. If we move over to an Unreal Engine 5 showcase, we're seeing Silent Hill 2 at 4K epic max settings, ray tracing turned on. It's 46 versus 39. It's one of the biggest leads we've seen so far for the 5080 at 18%, but neither GPU is actually probably at the frame rates you'd really want to be playing at. Although this is a very slow-paced game, you could play at these frame rates. I think you'd want to at least turn on DLSS quality, and now you're at 67 versus 62, so it's dropped to an 8% lead for the 5080, but now you're at decent frame rates for this style of slow-paced single-player game. Although if you want higher frame rates, you could go to DLSS performance mode, or you could have turned down graphics settings. Anyway, with DLSS performance, we're at 88 versus 80, which is a 10% advantage for the 5080. 4K epic settings, no ray tracing or upscaling. We're at 53 versus 46, so the 5080 is stronger, but it's still not able to hit a 60 FPS without upscaling. If you do use DLSS quality upscaling, now you're getting 85 versus 71. It's the biggest lead we've seen so far for the 5080 by 20%, so there is that. And if we go to 1440p epic settings with ray tracing turned on, I'm seeing 77 versus 68, which is a 13% advantage for the 5080. If we kick on DLSS quality, we're now getting a pretty good high refresh rate single player experience with 101 FPS versus 92, 10% advantage for the 5080. But again, I don't feel like it's a mind-blowingly different experience. At 1440p epic settings, we're getting 94 versus 80, which is an 18% advantage for the 5080. And Hellblade 2 Senua's Saga is another Unreal Engine 5 showcase. This one doesn't feature hardware-accelerated ray tracing, just the software-based Lumen. 4K high settings, and there's nothing above the high settings. We're getting 51 versus 46, 11% lead for the 5080. And again, you're still not over 60 FPS at native 4K on either GPU. Kicking on DLSS quality then makes sense, and that gets us to 82 versus 76. 8% lead for the 5080, not a mind-blowingly different experience. At 1440p high settings, it's a good experience on both GPUs. 8% lead for the 5080, 84 versus 78. And if we jump over to God of War Ragnarok, they actually both do a good job at native 4K Ultra, 85 versus 73, and it's a 16% lead for the 5080. Kicking on DLSS quality, they're both now a pretty high refresh rate experience for a single-player game at 118 versus 103, 15% advantage for the 5080. And if we go to 1440p Ultra, I don't think we need any upscaling, but I'm only seeing a 4% advantage for the 5080 at 117 versus 113. Oh no, I mistitled this. I'm gonna move my fat head over this. This is not God of War Ragnarok. This is Final Fantasy 16. Anyway, we're at a 13% advantage for the 5080 at 53 versus 47. Neither one is over 60 FPS. And 4K Ultra DLSS quality, we're at 81 versus 72, 13% advantage for the 5080. And at 1440p Ultra, we're at an 18% advantage at 91 versus 77. In Horizon Forbidden West, which I've now correctly titled, so I'll move my fat head out of the way, Um, we have 75 versus 69, nice, which is a 9% advantage for the 5080. So both doing a pretty good job at native 4K, but you can of course kick on DLSS quality, get 112 versus 102, 10% lead for the 5080. And kicking on 1440p resolution, I don't think you need any upscaling. The max settings run really well, 130 versus 120, 8% advantage for the 5080. Ghost of Tsushima, 4K very high, again getting a good experience, 76 versus 68, 12% lead for the 5080. And if you want a higher refresh rate experience, kicking on DLSS quality gets you 119 versus 107, 11% advantage for the 5080. If we look at 1440p very high settings, I don't think you need any upscaling or anything like that. 130 versus 118, 10% lead for the 5080. I want to test out at least one competitive multiplayer title turned down to low settings, because I think that's representative of what a lot of people actually do with their graphics cards, and turning down to basic settings, low settings in multiplayer games often give you a competitive advantage in both frame rate and even decluttering the environment in order to make it easier to spot enemies. With that being said, I'm only seeing a 6% advantage for the 5080 in this game at 145 versus 137 when using 4K, but at the basic preset. Going down to 1440p basic settings, I'm dropping to a 2% advantage, and at but high frame rates on both, 237 versus 232, and 1080p also only shows a 2% advantage at 303 versus 296. Again, at these extremely low settings, it's more possible to be reaching some system limitations, but it could also just be the architecture here just isn't really able to stretch its legs when only asked to compute the basic settings in this game. So how can we summarize what we've seen overall? So this is not the frame rates in each game, this is the percentage advantage for the 5080 in each game. At all of the tons of tests that I ran here, if we average all of them, we see it's an 11% advantage for the 5080 versus the 4080 Super. However, do keep in mind that if we sort this from best to worst result, the worst results for the 5080 are when Indiana Jones ran out of VRAM, so they tied, which is a bit of an outlier, not the settings you would actually use. And then these lower res Call of Duty results, which are most likely at least somewhat system limited, maybe not representative of the true extra power of the GPU. And so if we instead sort for only 4K results and remove the VRAM limited result, where both GPUs kind of sucked, we're now seeing a whopping 12% advantage on average for the 5080 versus the 4080 Super. If you're curious if ray tracing performed any differently, the answer is 11% better for the 5080 versus the 4080 Super, so not really. If you're still angry at me for not doing this as the 5080, versus the 4080 rather than the 4080 Super, then here's how we could adjust for that. Because the 4080, if I'm being generous, says reaches about maybe 97 to 98% of the performance of a 4080 Super, we could do this. We could say that if the 5080 is 12% faster than a 4080 Super, and the 4080 reaches about 97% of the performance of a 4080 Super, then we get a 15% generational uplift from 80 class to 80 class. And depending on how you think the 4080 and 4080 Super stack up, that will adjust by a percent or two. Like if it only reaches 98% of the or if it does reach 98% of the performance of 4080 Super, now we're looking at a 14% advantage. So anyway, we're looking at about a 14 to 15% generational uplift versus the 4080, and about a 12% uplift versus the 4080 Super, which we had at the same price 1 year ago. So really the only particularly new thing that we're getting here is the multi-frame gen, and my overall thoughts on multi-frame gen is it's nice to have. I do like it, but it's really only valuable on very high refresh rate displays. What I mean is it's not very good for taking a low base frame rate to a high frame rate. Like 30 times 4 to 120 looks pretty bad because there's a lot more image quality artifacts in the generated frames because of the large difference between the two actually rendered frames it's working off of. The higher your base frame rate, the closer the actual frames are, and the less guesswork has to take place, the higher the quality of the generated frames. And also, the higher your base frame rate, the better your input latency. Because notice that increasing the number of frames through frame generation, like ×2 versus ×4, actually made the latency a little bit worse. Depending on exactly where you're looking at this, the differences can be, a few milliseconds different, really something like that. But the point is, it's not making the game more responsive to increase the number of frames through frame generation. So you need enough of a base frame rate. Now, everybody's going to be different on where their tolerance level for that is, and it might even vary game to game. For me, 50 to 60 FPS in some games is going to be fine. In other games, I'd rather be 70 to 80 FPS before I kick it on. But what that means is if you're using ×3 or ×4 frame generation, let's say you're at 60 FPS, ×4 takes you to 240. So if you don't have a 240 hertz monitor, that's just going to be completely wasted. It's kind of useless. So do keep that in mind when you're factoring in the value of the frame gen. You really need an extremely high refresh rate display in order for that to make a lot of sense. Now, if you're watching this video for does it make sense to upgrade from a 4080 or 4080 Super to a 5080, I think the answer is obviously no. If you're asking which one's better because they cost, maybe I have no idea how much these will cost on the actual retail market once they release, I just know they're MSRPs. So if they end up costing similar values in the market, is the 5080 better than a 4080 and a 4080 Super? Yes, just not by a lot, and it does get the new frame gen, which is kind of nice. So I would say that overall, this is a historically low performance upgrade for the generation. Which is kind of frustrating. And while it's nice to see the price $200 lower than the 4080's MSRP of $1,200, keep in mind that they already corrected that with the 4080 Super a year ago. And that's kind of what we're looking at in this video. Also keep in mind that adjusted for inflation, previous 80 class GPUs generally cost more like in the $850-ish range in today's dollars, if we're being fair and adjusting for inflation. So this is still overpriced historically compared to previous generations of 80 class graphics cards. So anyway, I'm not sure this is particularly exciting, but that doesn't mean it's a bad graphics card. What is it good for overall? I would say to me, it's still a little weak for 4K path tracing. Because we didn't get enough of a baseline update to have me feel like using frame gen to kind of fill in the gaps feels great. Because keep in mind that if you're getting 104 FPS with ×2 frame gen, that's going to feel more like 50 FPS. As far as the input responsiveness, which isn't amazing. And at this base frame rate, there will be some noticeable image quality artifacts. In other words, I think a lot of people are going to be fine with this experience, but it's not really ideal. If we had got a larger improvement to the overall performance, it would have, we're just a little bit shy of where I think I'd be comfortable recommending this for 4K path tracing. We're just, it's usable, but it's not great. And if games get more demanding over the next couple of years, how long is that going to hang on? That's my kind of concern there. That being said, I think if you're talking for 4K but not doing path tracing, if we jump into some other random games, usually 4K DLSS quality when not using path tracing gets a pretty good experience. So I think this is a good 4K graphics card, just a little weak for path tracing. If you're more into the 1440p results, though, I think for 1440p path tracing, it's actually in pretty good shape. I'd probably use the Transformer model DLSS at the quality setting, and now we're getting a decent base frame rate, in this case about 73 FPS in Cyberpunk, and that's a decent base frame rate from which to use frame generation. So here, when you're using the ×2 frame gen to reach 126 FPS, it's gonna feel more like kind of 60 FPS. It's just a little bit better than the experience you're getting at the 4K, even when using performance mode upscaling at 4K. And again, the ×4 frame gen might be somewhat useful to take advantage of like a 240 hertz 1440p display, that kind of thing. So is the 5080 a good graphics card? It absolutely is. It gets you a great 1440p experience, I'd say, in pretty much any game at any settings that's currently available. And at 4K, it gets you a good experience in almost every game's max settings. But again, I would have liked a little bit more performance for 4K path tracing recommendation. And overall, it's just like, a year ago we got the 4080 Super, and If you didn't buy that, is there anything really motivating you to buy this if you were already in the market? Now, if you weren't looking at GPUs a year ago, but you're looking at GPUs now, it's better than the 4080 Super, just not mind-blowingly so. If you're curious, like maybe you're on a 3080, you skip generations, I am gonna do a direct head-to-head against the 3080, where I think we'll see a larger advantage and maybe a more worthwhile upgrade. If you're also on AMD GPUs like the 7900 XTX, I'm gonna do a head-to-head against that, because currently that's AMD's closest priced and highest end competitor, although it is still at a lower price overall. And AMD will be coming in soon with the 9070, 9070 XT. We don't officially know how those will perform or how they'll be priced, so we'll have to see how that stacks up in the future. Stay tuned to the channel if you want access to all of those head-to-heads. For channel members, I post them as soon as I have them finished, including just when the side-by-sides are done, but I haven't made graphs or filmed my voiceover yet. So you could take a look at that. On the main feed, I have to finish the graphs, make the voiceover, and then also give some space in the YouTube algorithm, usually separated by at least a day between big reviews, just so there's some space for YouTube algorithm performance. Anyway, hopefully you guys found this video useful and or interesting, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.